Hi, this is Professor Cordis, and this is the Week 2 lecture video for English 353 Children's Literature. This week, ladies and gentlemen, we are studying Cinderella, but more importantly, we are studying the adaptations of Cinderella. Cinderella is a classic fairy tale, and the wonderful thing about it is that it has been changed and modified and redone and adapted based upon time, based upon culture, based upon the author. And so it's very interesting to see how this has developed for the audience that it's being presented to. So while, yes, we are studying Cinderella and we are familiar with that story, our goal this week is to really understand how Cinderella is different and why is it different? Is it different because of culture? Is it because of time? Is it because of the audience? We're kind of beginning to look at this almost from like a cultural anthropologist. We're looking at this from someone who studies evolution of stories and myths, almost like a mythologist. Because when you look at Cinderella, there's so many great components that resonate with readers. And so you have this idea of a young girl or sometimes a boy who overcomes obstacles, who overcomes adversity and moves into a place where they are able to succeed. And so with the help of, a fairy godmother, supernatural aid, with the help of something, and sometimes it's magic and sometimes it's not, you see how Cinderella progresses to becoming successful. Now, I say successful because depending upon the story, depends on what the success is. So when you look at Cinderella, sometimes it's her falling in love and being with the prince. Other times it's just having her own independence from her family, or her finding her true self or her true identity. So looking at this, we're looking at these small components that we're able to switch and change and modify because they resonate so well with readers, with young audiences. So what you see on the screen here, I just Googled Cinderella literature, and I went on to images, and there's so many things that we can see and we can find. There's so many adaptations. The more I began to dig into the internet and search for adaptations, the more I found. It was going down a rabbit hole, so to speak, even though that's Alice in Wonderland reference. But there's so much. Most of us are probably familiar with the Disney version, the 1950s Disney version. And we're familiar with that because it has been a very and extremely popular version. There has been different versions along the way that resonate with us, but more or less, it's not necessarily Cinderella herself, it's the story. It is what is happening. It is those bigger themes that we begin to see with Cinderella. So when you look at all the different adaptations, you're kind of beginning to pull out, what is it that I need to focus on? What is it, the magic component? Is it the idea of a young, not helpless, but a young girl who is in need of help, who overcomes obstacles? When we look at the assignments for this week, the biggest one that we have is our Cinderella adaptation project. My colleague here, Dr. Bartles, she does a fantastic job of outlining this project. I'm not going to reiterate because she does a fantastic job of walking you through everything. But one of the things I will bring to your attention right now is this literary element, this motif, symbol, significant plot point that you need to kind of begin to pull out. Because for the most part, that's what Cinderella is all about. It's that one component. It's that one element that resonates with us. So a lot of people, I would say the mass majority of society, identifies Cinderella with, falling in love, happy endings, happily ever after, right? Like that's the ultimate goal. As that story is shifted and modified and changing, it changes with some sort of different message that's being projected. If you remember back, there's a film version with Drew Barrymore called Ever After. Yes, there is the concept of falling in love, but it's also the concept of Cinderella finding herself and finding her own identity, which was a big thing when that film was released. Women coming of age, trying to find who they are, right? You can see that idea bleed over into other, quote, fairy tales. So if you look at Enchanted with Amy Adams, which is a fantastic spoof of fairy tales, it actually kind of resonates with Cinderella. Even though she's wandering around this world not knowing what to do, there's still the component of her trying to be her own person and discover who she is and do what is right, just like Cinderella would. And so it's interesting in that film, she's the actual one to slay the dragon, which is more of a Sleeping Beauty component. But you get the same idea of women coming into themselves, almost encouraging this concept of women finding their own strength beyond the prince, right? There's lots of adaptations today that still embody this idea of a young boy or a young girl who is able to move past adversity, which is one of the things, it's the very first thing that's offered here as an example. A lot of people in the past, I know, have looked at the family component, looking at the absent father or the absent mother, looking at the components of where this girl comes from and why she behaves the way she does with her step family, her stepmother, stepsisters. But the idea of Cinderella is really those components. So if we look at all of these different things, like, yes, the music is wonderful for our Disney version. Young girls are able to pretend that they are Cinderella with the glass slipper. Like, those are components. But what are the bigger motifs, the themes, the messages that are being conveyed to our readers? Okay. So when you look here and you look at the old, right, you got to look at so many things: culture, time, author, the audience. What was going on in the 1950s when Disney made this version compared to Ella Enchanted for the audience of today, right? How are these things different? How are these things being pulled? I kind of like, it's almost like a deconstruction of a fairy tale. Week one, we learned about the fairy tale and all the different components to it, kind of the history of it. Here, if you deconstruct Cinderella, you've got all of these components, and most of them are listed here for you. Not all of them. These are just a recommended list. But the idea of deconstructing them and then using them for your own good. So let's say that there is a African tale of Cinderella. Okay, that's going to be made today. Okay, there's ones in the past. We're look at one today. Let's say they go for the area of Rwanda. Okay, and they make a Rwandan Cinderella. The authors are going to use the components of these and manipulate them however they see fit for the audience in which they are addressing. Okay, if you take this into Western culture for 2020, you're going to take components of Cinderella and manipulate them so that the story is relevant for those audiences. So you change and you modify and you adapt so that it is more resonant, right? Let's take this same concept. My daughter loves the story of Maleficent. She saw the movie. She loves the Sleeping Beauty. However, she doesn't resonate with Maleficent. She's not an evil child, but she likes that character. She really likes the Maleficent character from the two adaptation films. Well, going back to watching Disney's Sleeping Beauty, going back to offer my daughter different versions of Sleeping Beauty, she's able to see how small pieces are still in place. She's not able yet to identify the differences of how this young Aurora, the princess, is evolving, how the story themes are evolving, but she's able to pick up on these components. 3 fairies, the sinister family dynamics, motivation of our villain. She's able to pick up on those things and kind of see the progression, right? So when you look at Cinderella, you have to take into account all of those components. So for us as adults, this is going to kind of ruin Cinderella for us because we're almost pulling it apart. And that's the analytical side to this course, pulling it apart to study what are Cinderella's motivations. Where is the prince coming in and how is the prince being projected, right? What about the romantic interest? What about the family dynamics? How is that being conveyed, and analyzing them specifically for the audience in which it's believed to be intended? So when you go through, where are they? Our readings for this week, take into consideration how these are being projected for the reader. Our Chinese fairy tale is going to be so drastically different than our 1950s Disney Cinderella, right? The components are there. However, there's a different message. There's a different meaning. There's different motifs because the audience in which it's intended for, right? Think to yourself of what a audience, a young child would have for today, right? If we're changing and modifying Cinderella, how is it going to be different for today than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago? Okay. What is the time, the culture, the place that we are in? Excuse me. So with that being said, this is a fantastic way for us to review a specific piece of literature and understand how it evolves. Like I mentioned before, children's literature is fresh, it's new. There are components in which we look at and we pull from and we take as we progress through. And that's kind of the bigger picture of children's literature, right? So many people were astonished when Harry Potter came out and they were like, oh, it's such a new tale. Yet wizards and goblins and magic and all of those things have already been used. J.K. Rowling just used and twisted them into a new story that was relevant for our time period, right? Kids in the early 2000s, there was this need for a search identity. Going into a new millennium, where are we going? What's going on? Besides the fact that it's just a really well-written story, there was this component that everyone kind of jumped onto and characters that we could jump onto as well. So that's where Cinderella comes in. Cinderella has all of these components, and it's our job now to kind of figure out, wow, how are they being used? How are they being used for the audience in which it is being presented? So I have got maybe 3 or 4 other ancillary videos that I'm going to add that kind of build upon this idea. They deconstruct fairy tales and kind of help us understand the holistic idea for our child reader. Take a moment, go through those, listen to those, go through those. As you read through the story, keep those things in mind so that you can begin to analyze items for your project. Okay. Message me, email me if you have any questions or concerns. I will talk to you guys later. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoy.